Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's live stream. I'm Steve Stedman with Stedman Solutions, and today I'm going to be answering some questions about Microsoft SQL Server. There's a couple different ways that we get the questions that we talk about. One of them, you can post them in the chat window live while this is going on if you happen to catch us live. If you're watching it later, don't put them in the chat window, just fill out our form, which you'll be able to see at the end. Or you can fill out a web form to send them to me, and we'll try and get your questions answered. Another way is that questions that come up from customers that I work with during the week. Sometimes I will bring those, and so that we can get them answered and recorded and sent out there as well. So this week, I'll be the only one from Stedman Solutions here, and what we'll be covering is a handful of questions. All right, let's jump into it. Where's my questions? Question number one, what is Database Health Monitor? And this comes from a new customer that we're working with, and the question is, what is Database Health Monitor? Well, Database Health Monitor is an application that I've built over the last about, dozen years or so, since 2011. And it started out as being a DBA. I had my handful of queries that I would, whenever I worked on a new server, I'd bring in this batch of queries and run them against that server. And then I was working with a guy who said, well, why don't you take those queries and put them into some reports? So I started out and I took a bunch of those queries and put them into SSRS reports. And at that point in time, it was really like brand new SSRS, at least fairly new. And it was really cool the way we could make them look good and with some charts and diagrams and stuff like that. But then, as it evolved and I started working with more and more other servers, it became a bit of a challenge to say, well, every time we want to go work on a different server, I've got to take this batch of SSRS reports and deploy them over there and get everything connected. And SSRS at that point just didn't scale to something that was what I could use to do what I wanted to do with Database Health Monitor. So it wasn't that long, maybe in the first year, that I converted it from SSRS reports over to an application that you install and run as a desktop application. You run it, and anywhere that you can connect to a database, like for instance, anywhere that you use SQL Server Management Studio to connect to that database, you would use Database Health Monitor to connect to that database. Now, that's kind of where it came from, but what is it? It's a bunch of reports and monitoring and tracking and things that will keep track of what's going on in your database. Or reporting on things that need help. For instance, we have the thing called the Quick Scan report, and what it does, it goes through and analyzes your whole SQL server and looks at recommendations around security and performance and stability and backups and all those kind of things, and it comes back with a report of here's all the stuff that you could do to make your server more stable, run faster, more reliable, more secure, things like that. We also have in Database Health Monitor a lot of live reports where we can go and look, and it's really handy when you're working on a brand new server to be able to go look and say, okay, what's the biggest database and what's the biggest table in there, and what are the tables that have the biggest indexes? What are the tables that have indexes that aren't being used? What are the tables that are heaps that are not clustered? Things like that. So it's a quick way that when you're looking at a database to be able to go in and familiarize yourself with what's going on with that database. Now, beyond just the reports, which kind of map to queries that just get run and show you stuff about what's going on there, we have the concept of historic monitoring. And what the historic monitoring does, you turn it on, and it creates a small database where it's going to track information locally as to what's going on with your SQL server. It's going to track wait statistics. It's going to track the queries associated with those, the database associated with them, the user associated with them. It's also going to track CPU utilization and the number of blocking queries and things like that. That's the kind of thing that once it's installed and running, it runs and tracks and keeps track of what's going on with the SQL Server right now. And what's cool about that is when somebody comes along and says, hey, there was a problem on the SQL Server yesterday at 3 p.m. Can you look and tell me what was going on? Well, prior to something like this, the answer was, well, gee, I can look at the logs, and if there's nothing showing up in the logs, well, there really wasn't anything going on. But with the historic monitoring through waits and blocking and things like that, we can go and look and say, these are the queries that were running at this point in time by these people, and these are the problems that we were seeing. This is why, this is what we could do. Maybe here's an index we can add, or here's a query that needs tuning, or something that needs to change. Anyway, it's super useful. We use it in all of our performance tuning engagements as a way to be able to go and figure out what's wrong with the server and how do we make it run better. Then beyond that, part of Database Health Monitor, we also have a SQL Performance Monitor, which is an option you can turn on that is going to live track and monitor right now what's going on with your SQL server, what's blocking right now, and alert you on it. What's missing indexes could have helped with that blocking right now. How many users are on the system, what's going on, who's doing the blocking, things like that. And that's a tool that evolved from me when I would do like live performance monitoring for customers where they want me to track and keep track of everything on the server and make sure it's running good during some big event or some special day with a product release or something like that. And when I originally started doing that, I would have 5 or 6 or 8 different windows open. And what I've done now is try to merge all that into one application so that I can just start up Database Health Monitor and turn on the performance or the SQL Performance Monitor, and it will give me all the stuff that I previously used to have to go to 8 or 9 or 10 different windows to be able to track when I'm monitoring a live database during a live event. Anyway, Database Health Monitor, free to download. There's classes available. Check it out at stedman.us/download. All right, moving on to our next question. This question comes, I guess I didn't really phrase it very well here, but it came from a client talking about why do we need to establish a baseline? And I think establishing a baseline is an important thing in any part of performance tuning. And we have a client we're working with right now, and part of that performance tuning engagement is establishing that baseline and figuring out what does the condition of the server look like right now before we start making any changes, and what does it look like day to day. And then when we make changes, we can see from that baseline, did that change make things worse? Did that change reduce the number of waits that we're seeing? Did that change reduce the CPU load on the server? Did that change reduce the amount of blocking on the server? Did that change reduce the amount of memory? Things like that that are needed for queries to run. And when you're doing performance monitoring, gosh, I remember a guy I worked with more than a dozen years ago, and he would always have this like showman type presentation where it's like, oh, I did this and look at how much better it was. But then you go and look and say, well, it's not really better. You're just saying it's better. You should be a used car salesman, not a DBA at this point, or not a database programmer. And every time something changed, he said, yeah, this is better. And without a baseline, you couldn't prove if everything really was better or if he just thought his queries were better than everyone else's. So establishing a baseline is super important in any type of performance tuning so that you know, one, did you make improvements? And if someone comes along and says, which is undoubtedly going to happen if you do enough performance work, someone's going to say, well, gee, it seems kind of slow today. What did you change? Were you going to be able to go and look and say, well, no, it's not just slow, or there's something else causing it to be slow outside of the SQL server or whatever it may be. Or you might say, yeah, it is slow. I goofed on that, and I'm going to undo that change, and we're going to make it better for starting tomorrow. Anyway, with any type of performance tuning, establishing a baseline is super important. So one, you can prove that what you're doing is making a difference, a positive difference. And two, so you can kind of make sure you're covered. When somebody comes along and says things are slow, you can say, well, what's slow? And that's not showing up in my baseline. Okay, moving on to our next question. Okay, this is kind of a loaded question. This is a big question. So, what is sharding? And gosh, this is one of those you could probably go and prepare for a week and start writing your thesis paper on it or something like that. But basically, what sharding is, it's a concept that's used when you have a database that gets too big to fit into one database. And it's a way of splitting your database up so that whatever data you have is being split out amongst multiple databases. If you're familiar with partitioning, what partitioning does is it splits up data in different tables or virtually in different tables. But what sharding is, it's taking your data and splitting it up amongst completely different databases. One of the ways that I kind of think about sharding is that I worked for a company a long time ago where we had a software application that was used by fire and ambulance agencies. And it took thousands of fire department and ambulance agencies and put all of them into one single database. And if you wanted to look up an incident or find something, you had to filter everything based off of a customer ID. Now, an alternative to that, to putting them all in one big database, would be to have smaller batches of databases where maybe you split it up by fire department or ambulance agency in that case, or Or maybe you split it up by state, where you say all of those customers, or fire departments in this case, that are in Washington State, those go into one database. And all of those that are in Florida, those go into another database. And that's the way those are split is what's called the sharding key. And you could split it based off of any number of things, but you want to make sure that whatever your sharding key is, that you're doing it in a way that it's clear quickly to be able to find out where that specific customer, user, patient, whatever it may be, is located. So, example, if you had a sharding key based off of something like Social Security number, and this was a payroll database, well, most of the time when you're doing lookups of different people, if you're always searching on Social Security number, that might be a good thing to partition on. But if you're not commonly doing that and you're searching on name, maybe something related to name is another way to look it up. Now, one of the things, bumped my backlighting there. One of the things with sharding is you can either have a sharding key or a sharding function, which is a specific way of saying, given some piece of data, we definitively determine what shard someone goes to. Now, another way to do sharding is to have a lookup table where you say, okay, we're just going to take users who come into our system and we're going to round robin rotate them out to different shards, database 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And there's no function that directly maps to age or state or social security number or anything like that. Instead, with sharding, you have a lookup where you have to, when you want to find the user or the data you're looking for, you have to first go to a search database, find out which shard database that user is on, and then go and look it up on a specific shard. Anyway, sharding is one of those things that we've done a few times. I've worked with several clients over the years with different sharding environments, from just a couple of SQL servers up to much bigger than that. SQL Server is not a database platform that was built for sharding from the ground up, but there are ways to make it shard if you need to. There's also other database platforms out there that you can do sharding with that are designed or that are sharded from the beginning and that will scale and shard automatically for you. Anyway, the concept of sharding is something that you occasionally do have to do on SQL Server, and there are ways to do it, and there are ways to do it to make a system scale much larger than you'd ever be able to get to without sharding. All right, moving down. That was the last question for today. Let me check the chat window. There are no questions at this point submitted in the chat window. So I guess at this point, this is where I will say thanks for watching. We're going to do this every Tuesday. And sometimes we get people with questions, sometimes we don't. But I'm going to keep doing it as a way to work on my video skills and in order to be able to bring answers to our customers. Oh, speaking of video skills, one of the things, hopefully you noticed that if you compare this to our very first video, or the very first video I did, there's a lot better lighting, better background, stuff like that. So it's not looking quite as jaggy as it originally did. Anyway, thanks for joining us today. Have a great day. That wraps this up.